The North Atlantic, April 24th, 1943. The water was black as oil, cold as iron, and deep enough to swallow 1,000 secrets. Kapitänleutnant Günther Müller-Stöckheim stood hunched in the cramped control room of U-230, his fingers gripping the periscope handles with the kind of white-knuckled intensity that comes from 47 days at sea and 31 enemy ships sent to the bottom. The air inside the submarine tasted of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen pushed through scrubbers that had been running too long without maintenance. Outside, somewhere in the darkness above, a convoy of American merchant ships steamed eastward, carrying the materials that would feed Britain's war effort: steel, grain, aviation fuel, trucks, ammunition. Müller-Stöckheim had been tracking them for 6 hours, maneuvering his submarine into attack position with the patient precision of a hunter who knows his prey cannot escape. He believed the ocean was his ally, that the dark waters concealed his approach, that the vastness of the Atlantic provided cover no enemy could penetrate. He had been trained to trust the sea, to use its depths as armor, to strike from below and vanish into the abyss before the surface ships could retaliate. For nearly 4 years, this doctrine had served the U-boat fleet well, transforming Germany's submarine force into the most lethal maritime weapon the world had ever known. The statistics bore witness to their success. Millions of tons of Allied shipping destroyed. Thousands of merchant sailors drowned. Britain pushed to the edge of starvation by a blockade that tightened, like a noose around the island nation's throat. What? Müller-Stöckheim did not know. What he could not have known was that the ocean had already betrayed him. 6,000 yards away, the American destroyer escort USS Buckley moved through the darkness with electronic ears pressed against the underwater world, listening to sounds no human could hear unaided. Deep within the ship's hull, sonar operators hunched over their equipment, watching cathode ray tubes and listening through headphones to the acoustic signature of U-230's electric motors, to the rhythmic throb of machinery that marked the submarine's position as clearly as a beacon fire in the night. The Americans had been tracking Müller-Stöckheim for 93 minutes, plotting his course with mathematical precision, coordinating with 2 other destroyer escorts to form a triangle of steel that was even now closing around the German submarine like the jaws of a trap. The hunter had become the hunted, and he did not yet know it. This transformation, from predator to prey, from master of the depths to quarry being stalked through dark waters, represented one of the most decisive technological reversals in the history of naval warfare. The weapon that accomplished this reversal was not visible, not dramatic, not the kind of technology that inspired propaganda posters or stirred the blood of civilians reading newspaper accounts. It was sound itself, transformed into a weapon through the application of physics and engineering, through the development of systems that could listen to the ocean with an acuity that surpassed human hearing by orders of magnitude. The Americans called it Sonar, an acronym for sound navigation and ranging, and it would transform the battle. Of the Atlantic, from a struggle, the Germans were winning into a massacre from which the U-boat fleet would never recover. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must first comprehend the dominance that German U-boats achieved in the early years of the war, the terror they inspired, the strategic crisis they created for the Allied cause. When World War II began in September 1939, Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded a submarine fleet of only 57 boats, a force he himself acknowledged as grossly inadequate for the strategic mission of severing Britain's maritime lifelines. But what the U-boat fleet lacked in numbers, it compensated for through tactical innovation, aggressive leadership, and the simple physics of submarine warfare that favored the attacker over the defender. A submarine submerged beneath the waves was nearly invisible to surface ships. It could approach convoys undetected, select targets at leisure, fire torpedoes from positions that gave merchant ships no chance to evade. then slip away into the depths before escort vessels could mount effective counterattacks. The mathematics of this asymmetry were brutal. A single submarine, costing perhaps a few million Reichsmarks to construct and crewed by 45 men, could destroy merchant ships worth tens of millions of dollars and carrying cargo essential to Britain's survival. If enough submarines could be deployed, if they could sink ships faster than the Allies could build replacements, Britain would be starved into submission without Germany needing to risk its surface fleet or launch a cross-channel invasion. The campaign began slowly, constrained by Hitler's initial restrictions on attacking neutral shipping and by the small size of the U-boat fleet. But as the war expanded and more submarines entered service, the toll climbed with horrifying speed. In 1940, German U-boats sank 471 merchant ships, totaling over 2.1 million gross register tons. In 1941, the numbers rose to 432 ships and 2.1 million tons. Then came 1942, the year U-boat commanders would remember as the second happy time, when Admiral Dönitz unleashed Operation Drumbeat against the poorly defended American East Coast. The carnage defied comprehension. In January 1942 alone, 62 ships were sunk in American waters, many of them torpedoed within sight of the coastline, their burning hulks visible to civilians standing on beaches. The United States Navy, unprepared for submarine warfare and slow to implement the convoy system that the British had learned was essential for survival, watched helplessly as German submarines ranged along the Atlantic seaboard like wolves among sheep. By the end of 1942, U-boats had destroyed 1,160 Allied ships, totaling over 6 million tons, more than the total losses of the previous 3 years combined. For the men who crewed these submarines, those early years represented a kind of grim paradise, a time when their service combined genuine danger with reasonable prospects for survival, when tactical skill and courage could tip the balance between success and failure. They were volunteers, everyone, drawn from the Kriegsmarine's ranks by a combination of adventure, duty, and the promise of glory. They wore their service with fierce pride, knowing that they constituted an elite brotherhood, that they were the cutting edge of Germany's naval strategy, that their efforts were throttling Britain's ability to wage war. Korvettenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, the highest-scoring U-boat ace of the war, described the experience in a letter written to his wife in December 1940, before his capture the following March. "We are hunters in the truest sense, stalking prey across an ocean that conceals us and delivers our enemies to our torpedoes. There is danger, certainly. I would be a fool to deny it. But there is also the satisfaction of operating at the peak of one's abilities, of matching wits and skill against a worthy adversary. We are making history, changing the course of the war through our efforts. I cannot imagine any other service that would give me such purpose." What Kretschmer and his fellow commanders could not have anticipated was that the very medium in which they operated, the ocean itself, would be transformed. From ally to enemy through the application of technologies they barely understood, deployed with an industrial efficiency that would overwhelm German countermeasures before those countermeasures could even be properly developed. The science of using sound to detect underwater objects was not new in 1939. During World War I, Allied navies had experimented with hydrophones, essentially underwater microphones, capable of detecting the noise generated by submarine propellers and engines. These early systems were primitive, offering no directional information and requiring operators to distinguish submarine sounds from the countless other noises present in the ocean. Wave action, marine life, the propellers of friendly ships. Still, they represented the beginning of acoustic anti-submarine warfare, the first acknowledgement that the ocean could be made transparent through sound if only the technology could be refined sufficiently. Between the wars, research continued, primarily in Britain, France, and the United States. Scientists and engineers gradually developed more sophisticated systems that combined passive listening with active acoustic transmission, sending out pulses of sound and detecting their echoes when they bounced off underwater objects. The British called their system ASDIC, an acronym derived from the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee that had developed it. The Americans, characteristically, chose a simpler term, sonar. By 1939, both British and American navies possessed sonar systems capable of detecting submerged submarines under ideal conditions at ranges of up to 2,000 yards. But these systems suffered from severe limitations. The sound pulses they transmitted were relatively low frequency, which limited their resolution and made it difficult to distinguish submarines from schools of fish. Underwater geological features, or thermal layers in the water that created false returns. The equipment was temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and adjustment. Operators needed extensive training to interpret the acoustic returns correctly, to distinguish genuine targets from background noise and phantom echoes. Most critically, early sonar systems were effective only against submerged submarines. A U-boat running on the surface, as they routinely did at night, when they needed to run their diesel engines to charge batteries and pursue convoys at speeds impossible to achieve while submerged, presented a tiny acoustic target that sonar could rarely detect reliably. This limitation meant that German submarines could largely dictate the terms of engagement, submerging when threatened by surface ships and surfacing when conditions favored surface operations. The transformation that would doom the U-boat fleet required not a single breakthrough, but rather the convergence of multiple technological advances, each building upon the others, each refined through the grinding necessities of total war. American engineers and scientists, working initially from British research but rapidly developing their own innovations, began a systematic campaign to overcome sonar's limitations through a combination of improved hardware, better signal processing, and the kind of large-scale operational deployment that only American industrial capacity could sustain. The first major advance came through improvements in transducer technology, the devices that converted electrical signals into sound waves and vice versa. New materials and designs allowed higher frequency transmissions, which improved resolution and made it possible to detect smaller targets at greater ranges. By 1942, American sonar systems could reliably detect submerged submarines at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards under favorable conditions, giving escort vessels precious additional time to maneuver into attack positions. But the truly revolutionary development came through the deployment of sonobuoys, small, expendable acoustic sensors that could be dropped from aircraft into the water, where they would listen passively for submarine sounds and transmit what they heard via radio back to the aircraft. This innovation, developed at Harvard University's Underwater Sound Laboratory and rushed into production by American industry, extended the reach of acoustic detection far beyond what surface ships could achieve alone. A patrol aircraft could now saturate an area with sonobuoys, creating a temporary network of listening posts that could detect submarines over areas measuring hundreds of square miles. The third critical advance was organizational rather than purely technological, the development of coordinated hunter-killer groups that combined multiple destroyer escorts with escort carriers, all working together to locate and destroy submarines. These groups employed sonar in conjunction with radar and radio direction finding, using each sensor system to compensate for the limitations of the others, creating overlapping coverage that left submarines with nowhere to hide. For German U-boat commanders accustomed to thinking of the ocean as their refuge, the experience of being tracked by modern American sonar was profoundly disorienting. The submarine had not been seen, had not been detected by radar, had not transmitted any radio signals that could betray its position. Yet, somehow, the American escort vessels knew exactly where it was, were maneuvering to attack positions with a precision that suggested they could follow every movement the submarine made. The psychological impact of this experience, Knowing that you were being tracked by an enemy who could hear you, but whom you could not hear, that your concealment had been stripped away by invisible acoustic fingers probing through the water, was devastating. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, who survived 9 combat patrols and later wrote one of the most harrowing accounts of submarine warfare, described an encounter with American sonar in May 1943. "We were running submerged at 90 meters, our electric motors set to silent running, every man aboard ordered to remain absolutely still. We had been detected. We knew this because depth charges had been falling for the past hour, creeping closer with each pattern, walking toward us like the footsteps of some inexorable giant. What terrified us was not merely the explosions, but the knowledge that the Americans knew where we were, that they were tracking us through the water with a precision that rendered our attempts at evasion futile. We could hear their sonar pulses striking our hull, a metallic pinging sound that seemed to penetrate the steel plating and reach into our very bones. Each ping was a reminder that we had been marked for death, that there was no hiding from ears that could hear through thousands of meters of ocean. The sound Werner described, the active sonar ping, became the most dreaded sound in the U-boat fleet, more frightening than the explosion of depth charges because it represented the moment when concealment was lost, when the submarine's primary defensive advantage evaporated. That ping meant you had been detected, classified, and marked for attack. What followed was often a nightmare of evasion, the submarine twisting through the depths at maximum speed while depth charges bracketed its position, each explosion bringing the possibility of a ruptured hull, flooding compartments, a plunge into the abyss that would crush the pressure hull like an eggshell once it exceeded its design depth. The statistics of this transformation tell a story more eloquent than any individual narrative. In the first 5 months of 1943, before the full deployment of improved American sonar systems and hunter-killer groups, U-boats sank 594 Allied ships, totaling 3.2 million tons. But in May 1943 alone, 41 German submarines were destroyed. More than 13% of the entire operational fleet lost in a single month. The casualty rate had reached levels that not even the most fanatical Nazi propaganda could portray as acceptable. Admiral Dönitz, confronted with losses he could neither explain nor sustain, made the agonizing decision to withdraw his submarines temporarily from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The first acknowledgement that the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany. The withdrawal was temporary, but the strategic situation was not. As more American destroyer escorts equipped with advanced sonar entered service, as more escort carriers began providing air cover for convoys, as operational techniques were refined and crews gained experience, the casualty rates among U-boats continued to climb. In 1943, 237 German submarines were destroyed. In 1944, the number reached 242. The men who crewed these boats went to sea, knowing that their chances of survival were diminishing with every patrol, that they were participating in a campaign that had already been lost, that their deaths would accomplish nothing beyond postponing the inevitable defeat. Throughout this catastrophe, one element persisted as both reality and symbol: the ping of active sonar, that metallic sound transmitted through thousands of meters of water, bouncing off steel hulls and returning to receivers that could process the echoes and extract from them a submarine's position, depth, speed, and heading. The ping became the acoustic embodiment of American technological and industrial superiority, a sound that represented the transformation of the ocean from a medium of concealment into a transparent battlefield, where submarines could be tracked as easily as aircraft in a clear sky. But the ping was merely the audible manifestation of a much larger phenomenon. The sonobuoy networks dropped by patrol aircraft, the passive sonar arrays listening continuously for the acoustic signature of submarine machinery. The coordinated efforts of multiple ships using triangulation to pinpoint targets with mathematical precision. Every ping transmitted represented not just a single technology, but an entire industrial and scientific ecosystem. The research laboratories that had developed the transducers, the factories that had manufactured them by the thousands, the training programs that had taught operators to interpret acoustic returns correctly, the operational doctrines that had integrated sonar into comprehensive anti-submarine warfare systems. German U-boat commanders who survived the war and were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers expressed a recurring theme of bewilderment when they learned the scale and sophistication of American sonar deployment. Fregattenkapitän Rolf Mutzelberg, commander of U-203, was asked during his debriefing in June 1945 what had surprised him most about Allied anti-submarine capabilities. His response captured the fundamental shock of the technological asymmetry. We knew the Americans and British possessed sonar. Our intelligence services had informed us of its existence, and some of our commanders had encountered it as early as 1940. What we did not understand, what we could not have imagined, was the scale of deployment. We expected sonar to be rare, installed on a few specialized vessels, operated by highly trained experts. Instead, we discovered that it was universal, that every escort vessel possessed sophisticated sonar systems, that even patrol aircraft could drop listening devices into the water. The ocean, which we had considered our natural habitat, our source of protection, had been turned against us through the application of industrial-scale acoustic surveillance. It was as if the water itself had become our enemy. This transformation of the ocean from ally to adversary represented more than a tactical or technological shift. It constituted a fundamental revision of the strategic reality of submarine warfare. The entire German doctrine had been built on the premise that submarines possessed an inherent advantage in concealment, that a submerged vessel was effectively invisible to surface ships, that the vastness of the ocean provided infinite hiding places. American sonar shattered this premise. The ocean became transparent, or transparent enough that submarines could no longer rely on mere depth and distance to ensure survival. The psychological consequences of this reversal were profound and corrosive. German submariners had been trained to trust the water, to think of submersion as safety, to believe that diving beneath the waves transformed them from vulnerable targets into invisible hunters. Active sonar destroyed this confidence. Now, diving might merely delay detection rather than prevent it. Running silent might reduce but not eliminate your acoustic signature. The entire framework of submarine tactics had to be reconsidered, and the conclusions that emerged from that reconsideration were uniformly grim. There was no reliable way to hide from modern sonar, no tactical innovation that could restore the advantage of concealment that had made submarine warfare effective. Werner Herbert captured this psychological transformation in his memoir. We learned to dread the sound of sonar more than the sound of depth charges, because the ping represented the loss of our greatest weapon, invisibility. Once we heard that metallic echo striking our hull, we knew that everything that followed would be a matter of chance rather than skill, that our fate had been placed in the hands of luck and the accuracy of American weapons. This knowledge was psychologically devastating. We had been trained to believe that our survival depended on our abilities, our training, our discipline. Instead, we discovered that survival was primarily a matter of whether the Americans' sonar happened to be pointed in our direction when we were within detection range, the intelligence failure that allowed Germany to underestimate the threat posed by Allied sonar represents a case study in how authoritarian systems struggle to process information that contradicts their ideological assumptions. German naval intelligence was aware of sonar's existence. Captured British equipment had been examined. Interrogated prisoners had described the systems, and German scientists had conducted their own research into acoustic detection. But German intelligence analysts consistently underestimated both the technical sophistication and the scale of Allied sonar deployment. Part of this failure stemmed from mirror imaging. German sonar research had progressed slowly, constrained by limited resources and lower priority compared to other weapons programs. German analysts assumed that Allied programs faced similar constraints, that sonar would remain a specialized capability available only in limited quantities. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. American industry was producing sonar systems by the thousands, installing them not just on major warships, but on the hundreds of destroyer escorts being launched from shipyards across the United States at rates that would have exhausted Germany's entire naval construction capacity. But the deeper failure was ideological. National Socialist doctrine held that German technical and racial superiority would prevail over the quantitative advantages of the democracies, that quality would triumph over quantity. This belief made it psychologically difficult for German intelligence analysts to acknowledge that the Allies might achieve both quality and quantity, that American sonar systems might be not just more numerous, but also more sophisticated than German equivalents. Reports suggesting Allied technological superiority were filtered through ideological assumptions that rendered them less credible than they deserved. Satu result was a systematic underestimation of Allied capabilities that persisted, until direct battlefield experience made denial impossible. By the time German U-boat command fully grasped the extent of Allied sonar coverage, the strategic situation had already shifted beyond retrieval. The German response, attempts to develop quieter submarines, acoustic countermeasures, and new tactical doctrines, came too late and in insufficient quantities to alter the campaign's outcome. Tito, most ambitious German countermeasure was the development of acoustic torpedoes, designed to home in on the sound of Allied escort ships' propellers, allowing submarines to attack their hunters rather than merely evading them. The T-5 Zaunkönig Wren torpedo entered service in August 1943 and achieved some initial successes, sinking several escort vessels and temporarily creating anxiety among Allied anti-submarine forces. But the Allies quickly developed countermeasures, noisemakers towed behind ships that decoyed the acoustic torpedoes away from their intended targets, and the strategic balance remained decisively tilted against the U-boats. Germany also attempted to develop submarine designs that could operate submerged for extended periods, reducing their vulnerability to surface detection. The Type 21 U-boat, with its enlarged battery capacity, streamlined hull form, and snorkel breathing system, represented a genuine technological breakthrough that might have restored German competitiveness in the underwater warfare domain. But these submarines did not enter service in meaningful numbers until 1945, far too late to influence the campaign's outcome. Of the 118 Type 21 U-boats commissioned, only 2 conducted combat patrols before Germany's surrender, and neither achieved any success against Allied shipping. The experience of U-230, the submarine whose commander had believed the ocean protected him on that April night in 1943, illustrates the tactical reality of being hunted by American sonar with devastating clarity. Günther Müller-Stockheim, convinced he was maneuvering into position to attack an Allied convoy, had no idea that 3 American destroyer escorts had been tracking his submarine for over 90 minutes, that they had plotted his course with such precision that they could predict his position several minutes in advance, that they were coordinating their attack with the clinical efficiency of surgeons. At 2147 hours, USS Buckley, USS Reuben James, and USS George E. Badger began their coordinated attack run. The sonar operators aboard each vessel maintained continuous tracking, calling out ranges and bearings to their captains, updating target position every few seconds. At 1,500 yards, the destroyers increased speed to flank, their propellers churning the water as they raced toward attack, positions that would allow them to bracket U-230 with depth. Charge patterns calculated to ensure at least one weapon would detonate within lethal range of the U. Submarine's pressure hull. Müller-Stockheim first became aware of his danger when his hydrophone operator reported fast-moving propeller sounds, approaching from multiple directions. The captain immediately ordered crash dive to maximum depth and hard turn to starboard, attempting to evade what he now understood was a coordinated attack. But his maneuvers had been anticipated. The American sonar operators tracked every movement, adjusting their attack parameters to compensate for the submarine's evasive actions. The first pattern of depth charges, 8 weapons set to detonate at depths, varying from 200 to 400 feet, fell into the water at 21:51 hours. They sank through the darkness for several seconds before their hydrostatic fuses triggered detonation. The explosions transformed the water into a medium that transmitted shock waves with murderous efficiency. Inside U-230, the effect was catastrophic. The submarine was struck by multiple shock waves simultaneously, each one transferring enormous energy into the pressure hull, buckling steel plates, shattering instruments, tearing equipment from its mounts. Müller-Stockheim was thrown against the periscope housing with such force that he fractured his left arm and 3 ribs. The control room lights extinguished, plunging the interior into darkness broken only by the red glow of emergency lanterns. Water began spraying through ruptured pipe joints and cracked hull seams. The submarine lost depth control and began settling toward the bottom. Its dive planes jammed. Its ballast tank systems damaged beyond immediate repair. In the engineering spaces aft, the damage was even more severe. The diesel engines had torn free from their mounts and shifted several inches, rupturing fuel lines and creating a fire hazard. The electric motors that powered the submarine while submerged had suffered bearing failures and were no longer capable of delivering thrust. U-230 had been transformed from a sophisticated weapon system into a steel coffin sinking inexorably toward the ocean floor. 300 meters down, well beyond the submarine's collapsed depth, Müller-Stockheim, recognizing that his vessel was doomed, gave the order to surface and abandon ship. The crew used the last of their compressed air to blow some ballast tanks, giving the submarine just enough buoyancy to claw its way back toward the surface. U-230 broke through the waves at 22 to 3 hours, its conning tower emerging into the night air, while water continued flooding into the hull through multiple ruptures. Müller-Stockheim and his crew scrambled onto the deck and began inflating life rafts while the submarine settled deeper in the water behind them. The American destroyers closed in, their searchlights illuminating the scene with harsh white light that rendered everything in stark relief. The sinking submarine, the German sailors in their life rafts, the oil-slicked water reflecting the searchlight beams. USS Buckley recovered 41 survivors from U-230, including Müller-Stockheim. 4 members of the crew had died in the initial depth charge attack, crushed by falling equipment, or drowned when their compartment flooded before they could reach an escape route. Müller-Stockheim, taken aboard the American destroyer as a prisoner of war, was treated for his injuries by the ship's medical officer and then brought to the captain's cabin for preliminary interrogation. The American captain, Commander Bernard J. Mulligan, asked Müller-Stockheim how long he had known the destroyers were tracking him. The German officer replied that he had been unaware of any pursuit until moments before the attack began. Mulligan informed him that his submarine had been under continuous sonar surveillance for 93 minutes prior to the attack, that every maneuver had been tracked, that the final attack had been coordinated between 3 ships, working from sonar data of such precision that they had been able to predict his position with an accuracy measured in tens of meters. The expression that crossed Müller-Stockheim's face, according to Mulligan's after-action report, was one of stunned disbelief. The German captain had spent 47 days at sea, had successfully evaded detection by multiple Allied patrol aircraft and surface ships, had sunk 3 merchant vessels, and had considered himself a skilled practitioner of submarine warfare. To learn that he had been tracked for over 90 minutes without his knowledge, that the ocean he trusted to conceal him had become transparent to American technology, shattered his understanding of the tactical environment in which he had been operating. The interrogations of German submarine officers captured during the latter half of the war reveal a consistent pattern of responses that illuminate the psychological impact of Allied sonar superiority. Commander after commander expressed variations of the same themes: shock at the range and accuracy of detection, bewilderment at the scale of deployment, growing despair as they realized that no tactical innovation could restore the advantages they had once enjoyed. Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Lüth, one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders, was asked during his interrogation in October 1944 what advice he would give to German submariners if the war were to continue. His response was brutally candid. "I would tell them not to volunteer for submarine service." By 1943, we had already lost the Atlantic. The technology that the Americans and British deployed against us was so superior to our countermeasures that survival became primarily a matter of chance. Skill and experience still mattered, but they could only reduce the odds of death, not eliminate them. A submarine captain in 1944 is not a hunter, but a target. And the best he can hope for is to delay his inevitable destruction long enough to perhaps sink one or two enemy ships before his own vessel is sent to the bottom. This assessment was supported by the statistical record. Of the 863 German U-boats that conducted combat patrols during World War II, 754 were destroyed, an attrition rate of 87%. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, more than 30,000 were killed, a casualty rate of 75% that exceeds any other branch of any nation's military service during the war. The majority of these losses occurred after mid-1943, after Allied sonar and radar and coordinated anti-submarine tactics had transformed the Atlantic from a contested battle space into a killing ground for submarines. The human cost of this slaughter is difficult to comprehend in the abstract. Each of those 30,000 deaths represented an individual tragedy. A young man, usually in his 20s, who had volunteered for submarine service, who had survived rigorous training, who had been told he was serving a glorious cause, who died in darkness and terror as his submarine was crushed or flooded or torn apart. Most died without ever seeing their killer, without understanding the technologies that had detected them, without even the cold comfort of knowing that their sacrifice served some strategic purpose. They died because the war continued grinding forward under its own momentum, because their commanders lacked the moral courage to acknowledge that the campaign was lost, because totalitarian systems prioritize ideology over reality even when that ideology demands the pointless sacrifice of tens of thousands of lives. Werner Herbert, writing years after the war ended, reflected on the waste of it all. By 1944, every man in the U-boat service knew that we were losing, that our missions were futile, that we were being sent to sea to die for no purpose beyond postponing the acknowledgement of defeat. We went anyway, some from discipline, some from loyalty to our comrades, some from simple inability to imagine any alternative. We had been told for so long that we were heroes, that our service was essential, that surrender was unthinkable. The truth, that we were being murdered by our own leadership, that our deaths accomplished nothing, was too terrible to fully acknowledge. So we climbed into our steel coffins and went to sea, listening for the ping of enemy sonar, waiting for the depth charges that would end our lives. The technological and tactical lessons learned from the Battle of the Atlantic extended far beyond that specific campaign, shaping the development of naval warfare for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. The primacy of acoustic detection in anti-submarine warfare became a fundamental axiom of naval operations. Every navy invested heavily in sonar development, seeking to improve detection ranges, classification accuracy, and resistance to countermeasures. Submarines evolved to become quieter, employing sound-dampening materials, sophisticated propeller designs, and nuclear propulsion systems that eliminated the need to surface for air or battery charging. But the fundamental truth established in the Atlantic during 1943 and 1944 remained valid. The ocean is transparent to sound, and any object moving through water generates acoustic signatures that can be detected by sufficiently sensitive listening equipment. The submarine's advantage in concealment, which had seemed so overwhelming in the early years of World War II, proved to be contingent rather than absolute. When opposing navies deployed sonar systems of sufficient sophistication and in sufficient quantities, that advantage evaporated, and submarines became vulnerable to detection and destruction. The United States Navy emerged from World War II as the unquestioned leader in anti-submarine warfare technology and operations. The industrial capacity that had produced thousands of sonar systems during the war continued to support research and development programs that pushed the frontiers of acoustic detection. American submarines and surface ships were equipped with sonar systems of steadily increasing capability, and these systems were integrated into comprehensive maritime surveillance networks that could monitor vast expanses of ocean for submarine activity. This technological leadership had strategic consequences that shaped the Cold War and beyond. Soviet submarines, despite being numerous and in many cases technically sophisticated, operated under the constant awareness that American and NATO sonar networks could detect them at ranges that varied depending on conditions, but often exceeded tens of nautical miles. The acoustic transparency of the ocean, first demonstrated against German U-boats in the Atlantic, became a persistent constraint on Soviet naval operations, limiting their ability to operate undetected and providing NATO forces with a crucial intelligence advantage. The technological lineage extends directly from the sonar systems that hunted U-230 to the modern acoustic arrays that monitor the world's oceans today. Towed arrays deployed from surface ships, fixed installations on the ocean floor, sonobuoys dropped from patrol aircraft, sophisticated signal processing systems that can isolate submarine signatures from background noise with extraordinary precision. The ping that so terrified German submariners in 1943 has been joined by passive detection systems that merely listen, never transmitting, extracting from the ambient ocean soundscape the subtle acoustic clues that betray a submarine's presence. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Atlantic was decided not by courage or tactical brilliance, though both were displayed in abundance by participants on all sides, but by the invisible war of technology, by the capacity of allied nations to develop, produce, and deploy weapon systems at scales that overwhelmed German countermeasures. Sonar was merely the most dramatic example of this technological superiority, but it was part of a larger pattern that characterized the entire Allied war effort. Whether one examines radar development, cryptanalysis, aircraft production, naval construction, or any other dimension of military technology, the same pattern emerges: Allied advantages in scientific research, industrial capacity, and cooperative development translated into decisive battlefield superiority. Germany, despite possessing talented scientists and engineers, despite developing some innovations that were ahead of Allied equivalents, could not match the scale and coordination of Allied technological programs. The German war economy, constrained by limited resources and hampered by ideological interference in scientific research, simply could not compete with the combined industrial and intellectual resources of the United States, Britain, and their allies. For the German submariners who experienced this defeat firsthand, who watched their service transform from elite naval force to sacrificial victims, the implications extended beyond the purely military. They had been raised in a system that preached German superiority, that insisted will and discipline would triumph over material advantage, that promoted the myth of inevitable Aryan victory over racially inferior opponents. The reality of the Atlantic demolished these myths through the most direct form of instruction: repeated, devastating defeat administered by technologies they could not counter, and industrial capacity they could not match. This experience created psychological dissonance that many submariners struggled to resolve. Some retreated into denial, blaming defeats on bad luck or tactical errors rather than acknowledging fundamental technological inferiority. Others began questioning the propaganda they had been fed, recognizing that they had been lied to about the relative capabilities of Germany and its enemies. A few underwent more profound ideological transformations, recognizing that the entire National Socialist worldview had been revealed as fraudulent by the test of total war. Müller-Stockheim, the commander of U-230, spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in the United States, where he had ample time to reflect on his experiences. In a letter written to his wife in December 1944, a letter intercepted and read by American intelligence before being delivered, he wrote, "I have come to understand that we were fighting not merely against superior numbers, but against superior systems, against nations whose political and economic organization gave them advantages we could never match. The Americans defeated us not through any racial superiority. The National Socialist claim that they are mongrel inferiors has been proven laughable, but through the strength of their industry, their science, their capacity for large-scale cooperation. I fear we were never fighting a war we could win, that our leadership sent us into battle against enemies whose advantages were so fundamental that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome them." The North Atlantic today is empty of submarine wolf packs, empty of convoy battles, empty of destroyer escorts dropping depth charges while hunting U-boats through the darkness. The waves rise and fall with the same indifference they showed in 1943, unconcerned with the human dramas played out upon and beneath their surface. But the ocean floor holds the rusted remains of hundreds of submarines, steel monuments to the men who died learning that technology trumps ideology, that industrial capacity matters more than propaganda, that the ocean itself can be transformed from sanctuary to trap through the application of acoustic, physics, and electronic engineering. The ping of active sonar, that metallic sound that once struck terror into the hearts of German submariners, has become routine. A standard tool of naval operations, its revolutionary nature obscured by familiarity. But in 1943, that sound represented a transformation as profound as any in the history of warfare. The ocean made transparent, concealment stripped away, the hunter revealed as prey. It was the sound of American industrial and scientific capacity applied to the specific problem of submarine detection, the acoustic signature of democracy at war. The lesson extends beyond the purely military realm. The Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated that technological competition between nations reflects deeper differences in how those societies organize themselves, how they conduct research, how they allocate resources, how they coordinate efforts across institutional boundaries. Authoritarian systems like Nazi Germany can achieve impressive feats of innovation when driven by military necessity, can mobilize resources with apparent efficiency, can generate tactical successes through aggression and surprise. But in extended competitions, when the struggle becomes one of sustained innovation, industrial production, and systematic application of scientific knowledge, open societies possess structural advantages that become decisive. Democratic systems, for all their apparent inefficiency and internal debate, prove better at conducting the kind of cooperative, long-term research that generates fundamental technological breakthroughs. They can draw on broader pools of talent, recruiting based on ability rather than ideological conformity. They can admit mistakes and correct course more readily than systems built on rigid hierarchies and ideological orthodoxy. They can engage in international cooperation, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that closed societies struggle to match. The sonar systems that defeated the U-boats emerged from exactly this kind of cooperative, open research environment. British scientists sharing their discoveries with American engineers, university laboratories working alongside military researchers, industrial firms competing to develop better production techniques while sharing fundamental knowledge about acoustic physics and transducer design. This ecosystem of innovation could not have been replicated in Nazi Germany, where ideological considerations distorted research priorities, where racial policies drove talented scientists into exile, where institutional rivalries and bureaucratic infighting hampered coordination. 30,000 German submariners died learning this lesson, their lives spent in service to a cause that deserved to fail. Their sacrifice wasted on a regime that valued ideology over human life. Their deaths bear witness to a truth that transcends the particular circumstances of their war, that in the end, free societies possess resilience and adaptability that authoritarian alternatives cannot match, that openness and cooperation generate advantages that no amount of rigid discipline can overcome, that the sound of freedom, transmitted through the ocean as a sonar ping, as the echo of industrial capacity applied intelligently, will ultimately triumph over the false promises of totalitarianism. The waves continue their eternal rhythm, rising and falling above the wrecks of submarines, indifferent to history. But those wrecks remain, monuments to men who believed propaganda and died for it, testaments to the cost of ideological delusion, acoustic graves marked by the silence of defeat. The ping no longer sounds over those steel coffins, but its echo resonates through history. The sound of an ocean transformed from ally to enemy, the metallic signature of technology triumphing over courage. The acoustic proof that in total war between industrial societies, the nation that can best harness its scientific and industrial resources will prevail, regardless of ideology, regardless of will. Regardless of how fiercely the losing side proclaims its inevitable victory, even as it drowns in waters made transparent by sound itself.